the results have been quite magical. According to my birth certificate, I was born on the 25th of April, 1932. Though, until I was 18, when the certificate was dug out of a cupboard for a passport application, I always celebrated my birthday on the 23rd. Well, whenever it was, I was born in Ilkeston, a small Derbyshire mining town. My grandfather and father were both doctors, and it was expected there would be a third brass plate on the gatepost of Rutland House, which combined the family home with the general practice. My grandfather, William, had moved into the house at the end of the 19th century and practised there until his early death in the mid-20s. It was a large, early Victorian house set in an extensive garden. On the ground floor there was an ancient well covered by a square flagstone with a metal ring in the centre, and as a child I was fascinated by it and always wanted to look down it. The joke was that this was where the doctors hid their mistakes. Although we missed each other by quite a few years, I feel a great affinity with my grandfather. He also had a profound interest in spiritual matters. He was a Freemason, a hypnotist, a theosophist, a spiritualist, a homeopath, and an esotericist with a special interest in Rudolf Steiner. He gave half of the garden of Rutland House to the Rudolf Steiner Society to build a school. Steiner was an esoteric philosopher with an extraordinary insight into the spiritual realms. So, Michael House School, built in the classic Steiner style with the minimum of straight lines and corners, became our new neighbour. In many ways, my grandfather was decades ahead of his time. He was what we would call now New Age, and he would spend many evenings with the local vicar, the Reverend Butterton, drinking claret and debating metaphysical matters into the early hours. My father had no interest or involvement in any of these things, and so a generation was skipped. When I was growing up, our household consisted of my parents, Vincent and Hester, my sister, Beryl, who was 3 years older than me, a maid, and a doctor who was my father's assistant. I was born during the Depression, when people often had very little. Mining areas suffered particularly badly at that time. Ours was a middle-class household, but my mother was always quite frugal, always making do. There was no waste, no throwing things away, and you had little segs you could nail into your shoes to prevent them wearing out, leather patches on the elbows of your jacket, and you mended the inner tube of your bike. My mother herself had a very tough childhood. She was very artistic and would have loved to have gone to art school or music school, but her father, Albert, who was something of a drinker, would have none of it. Instead, she had to work in the family shop in Blackpool from the age of 14. It sold ice cream and sweets, and it was there that she met my father. He had had rheumatic fever and been sent to Blackpool to convalesce, and he used to ride past the shop on his bicycle, and he caught my mother's eye. He never came into the shop, but there was a big lamp-post outside, and one day he put a note on it, asking her to meet him on the promenade. It took several years before they started courting properly, but my father used to go back to Blackpool every year to see her. He was going to be a medical student at St Bartholomew's in London, and eventually her family encouraged the match. Just as my father was qualifying, his father died, followed 3 days later by his mother, both of influenza. So my father had to take over the practice before he really had any practical experience at all. He'd been left with a pile of debts, and his younger brother, John, was just starting to study medicine at Bart's and was living off an allowance paid for by the family. My father was a conscientious man and worked terrifically hard. In those days there was no National Health Service, and a general practitioner was on call round the clock and also did his own dispensing. Uncle John, meanwhile, continued to live off the family allowance while studying at St Bartholomew's.